There's a moment watching I Love L.A, the new show on HBO created by Richard Sennett, where you realize the show knows exactly what kind of audience it wants to cultivate. It's people who understand irony instinctively, people who live online but want to be out in the real world, people who laugh first and ask questions later. In other words, Gen Z, which is exactly why I feel very qualified to talk about this topic of this show. And yet, watching I Love LA, I kept asking questions of myself and noticing some quiet friction. Not that the show doesn't understand Gen Z humor, but that it understands it too explicitly. Because Gen Z humor isn't just ironic and sarcastic, it's self consuming. It undermines itself as soon as it's being performed. And that's where the real struggle begins. So I really want to talk about I Love LA, its humor, and why I think it doesn't quite work despite its best kind of attempts to do so. People often describe Gen Z humor as ironic, detached, self aware, absurd, but that's only the surface. Gen Z irony isn't about mocking things, though that is something that happens. It's about never letting meaning settle. You know, the joke collapses as soon as it forms, right? Sincerity is introduced only to be revoked. Emotional moments are punctured before they can become embarrassing. If there's one thing Gen Z hates, it's embarrassment because they grew up online. Irony functions as armor. So when a show like I Love LA tries to deploy irony deliberately, clever dialogue, meta jokes, characters who know the discourse, it runs into a problem. Irony stops working as soon as it's intentional. Because the entire point of Gen Z humor and its use of irony is that it refuses to be captured and it refuses to ever let meaning settle. As long as it's deliberate and intentional, it self ironizes itself and it becomes sincere. And that's where I think I Love LA struggles to actually capture the Gen Z spirit. I Love LA clearly understands the Gen Z language. The pacing mimics social media conversations, characters speak in half sincerity, half ironies, emotional beats are quickly undercut. Everyone is aware that they're performing either for the screen, right, the camera that's always watching, or actual people out in the world. The show constantly signals, we get it, we know how this sounds, right? But that's exactly where the irony starts to fold in on itself. Gen Z humor works best when it feels accidental, when meaning slips, not when it's carefully engineered the way it is in the show. When a joke feels way too constructed, it starts to resemble branding. And I Love LA sometimes feels like it's a show trying to demonstrate Gen Z humor rather than live inside it. The result isn't bad, but it is cautious, and Gen Z really does not have kind of the space and time for caution. This isn't obviously a problem that's unique to I Love LA. Look at the recent history of shows that have claimed to represent Gen Z. So we have Euphoria, which I think was the most successful at it, especially with season one. You know, it tried to capture Gen Z through excess. There was trauma, there was addiction, there was spectacle. And it did work in season one. But by the time season two came around, even though it was a bigger show, people started to kind of turn on it. It became ironic but not representative. It felt mythic and not lived in. The Gossip Girl reboot leaned heavily into social justice language and online awareness, and it ended up feeling like a PowerPoint presentation about the discourse instead of actually just letting these people live their lives. The Idol by Sam Levinson again tried to provoke, but it confused, the shock that it kind of garnered with relevance, and it collapsed under its own self-importance to be the moment and the kind of Gen Z show. Again and again, these shows make the same mistake. They treat Gen Z like a demographic, which it is, but it's also a moving target. You have to remember, people in Gen Z have grown up on the internet where everything moves very quickly. And so by the time a show defines what Gen Z is, people have already moved on. So let's lay out the paradox. A show that claims irony loses it. A show that names self awareness becomes uncool. Gen Z irony thrives on instability, on the feeling that nothing is solid enough to take seriously for too long. But television especially prestige television, especially an HBO show, requires structure, character arcs, emotional payoff, certain kinds of narrative coherence. So a Gen Z show is always kind of fighting its own medium. I Love L.A. is trying to tell a story about people who don't fully believe in stories anymore. These are all people who live in LA, kind of the land of TV and movies and shows. But people who distrust sincerity, I think, especially Gen Z, secretly crave it. So I think, ironically, the way to make a Gen Z show is to be sincere. And people who joke their way around pain, like, Gen Z people do, want to have that kind of experience that's too much. And that's not easy to dramatize, obviously, and the show deserves credit for even attempting it, because I do think that as the show goes on, it actually becomes better and actually starts to get to what Gen Z is. Instead of focusing on the jokes and the irony, it kind of does have these moments where we cut the jokes and actually get into something real. And I think that's what I Love LA kind of does as it goes on, especially episode 5, 6. I think those were really, really great episodes. And so, as the show goes on, we get to see how Maya, for example, and her relationship with her boyfriend Dylan, that relationship breaks down because Maya is a typical kind of Gen Z person. She doesn't view Dylan's feelings in a very sincere way. She doesn't take him seriously enough. And I think that's where the show starts to get its footing and starts to get its grip, in that it actually sees that sincerity and emotions are the key, as they always have been for a really good story. We get to know more about how Alani, she uses a lot of humor to mask up what was actually a very kind of traumatic kind of childhood with her father and everything. We get to see more about Tallulah. Like, the show gets better the more sincere it is. And I think that's where we can actually kind of start to see this show getting better. And I think season 2 is going to be a really, really great addition to the show. So I've kind of said all this stuff about its humor and its progression, but I think the more sincere the show becomes, especially later on in the season, the better it goes and the more it actually captures the Gen Z spirit that they're kind of trying to go for. So let me know, guys, what you think about the humor in the show, about the attempt of making a Gen Z show, and what you guys think about potential season 2. I know they already greenlit that. So tell me what you guys think about the show, and yeah,